This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Obviously, the worldwide flood was very important to God. He gave us a good bit of information about it. The way we have our Bibles divided, it is in the 6th and 7th and 8th and part of the 9th chapter of the book of Genesis. But not everybody believes that the flood was really worldwide. Some of them believe that it just mainly filled the Mesopotamian Valley and that was it. As a matter of fact, even in one of our Brotherhood commentaries, in volume 2 on page 174 of the Old Testament, there's a question that says, was Noah's flood worldwide or local? And the quote says, there is simply not sufficient concrete information to allow a dogmatic judgment on this matter. Well, I don't want to be dogmatic, I guess, in the way that we normally think about that. Usually that's a little catchword that somebody uses when they don't really like somebody else's answer. But I would like to give you about 30 or 40 reasons from the Bible that I think there is enough reason to believe that it was a worldwide flood. And so let's go through some of the things in the book of Genesis. If you have your book there, you'll want to go with me on that. If you'll turn to Genesis, the 6th chapter, we're going to start there, and I'm just going to go through various passages. And actually, as we get toward the end, I'll be jumping out of Genesis and going to some other places too, where the flood is referred to. But if you're a Bible believer, there is no reason that you have to believe that the flood was not worldwide based on what the Bible says. So let's look at some of those passages. Genesis 6, verses 11 and 12 say that the earth was filled with violence and corruption. And it says that all men were evil. It doesn't say just the people in the Mesopotamian Valley or around Noah were evil, but all men were evil. In chapter 6, verse 15, the construction of the ark with at least 1.5 million cubic feet of space in it seems a little bit extra work just for carrying 8 people out of a local flood and a few animals there. Well, in Genesis 6:17, God actually said that everything with the breath of life on the earth should die. And then in Genesis 6:18, the purpose of the ark was to keep 2 of everything alive. Now, if there was just a local flood, why would you need the ark? Not only could they have gotten away from the Mesopotamian area in 100 years or however long Noah had to build the ark, God, at least in the Bible, talks about 120 years, and maybe that was the length of time before the ark, before the flood came, or at least something over 50 or 100 years would have been the length of time. All the animals could have gone to some other place, as could Noah and his family. Certainly if God was just going to destroy that Mesopotamian valley, why not just say, Moses, pack up your family and just head east or west or north or some way to get out of the Mesopotamian valley. Also, in Genesis the 7th chapter, verse 10, there is the word for flood. In Hebrew, it's mabul, and that is the only word that is used for Noah's flood in the entire Old Testament. Now, there are other words that are used for other floods, like the flood of the Jordan or whatever else, but not this word. M-A-B-B-U-L is this word, and it's only used of Noah's flood. In Genesis, the 7th chapter, verse 11, it says, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. And that means all the subterranean water supplies, all the water that is under the entire surface of the earth came up all in one day. That would also mean there would be a lot of changes on the face of the earth. And then in chapter 7, verse 12, the rain poured continuously for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, I realize that there are places where it may rain 40 days and 40 nights today, but with the water coming up from beneath the earth, and then if there was something else, which we'll talk about later, like perhaps a water canopy or a vapor canopy, that would certainly have added to that. And even let me say, today, if all the water that there is in the atmosphere came down all at once, all over the earth, there would only be 2 inches today. So we may want to talk about something else that perhaps was there, and there is evidence that the water canopy was there. But let's go ahead now with just the biblical account. In Genesis, the 7th chapter, verses 19 and 20, all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. As a matter of fact, 15 cubits, at least 22 feet, over the top of the highest hill. And by the way, in Hebrew, the word for hill and mountain is the same. But we don't have to expect the flood to have covered all the mountains that are up today. And we'll talk about why that is in a little while. In Genesis 7:21, it says, every man died that was on the earth. In 7:22, all flesh with the breath of life in the dry land died. In Genesis 7:24, the waters stayed at the maximum for 5 months. Now, what kind of local flood have you ever heard or read about that the water stayed at a maximum for 5 months, 150 days? And then in Genesis 8:2, the great fountains of the deep were opened for that entire 5 months. Water continually coming up from the bottom as well as falling from the 40 days from the top. And then in Genesis 8:4, the ark floated over the mountains for 5 months. And we'll talk about Psalm 104, verses 6 to 10 a little bit later, but remember that. And then in the 5th verse of chapter 8, water receded 2.5 months before the mountaintops were seen. And then in verse 9 of chapter 8, doves found no suitable place even after 4 months. So the water was up for 5 months at its high level, and then it was receding for 4 more months, and a dove found no place to get to light. Now, what kind of local flood are we talking about here, if it were local? Then verse 11, plants began budding 9 months after the flood began. Then in verse 14, the occupants were in the ark for over a year. How could a local flood last that long? And in verse 22, the present uniformity of nature dates to the end of the flood. And we'll talk a little bit more about the scientific end of that in a minute. In chapter 9, verse 1, it says that the earth was going to be filled with the descendants of Noah. Now, if everybody was not killed in the flood, then certainly there are more than just Noah's descendants around. And then man was permitted animal food after the flood, which means there was a real line of demarcation because before that time, neither man nor animals could eat meat. After that time, both man and animals could eat meat. And then in chapter 9, verse 11, the flood that came was promised by God never to come again on the earth, and the rainbow was given as a sign. Now, did that rainbow mean that God would not have any more local floods? It seems to me that I've read in the newspapers about local floods, some of which killed many, many people. If that is really the case, then we can't trust God, because the rainbow is supposed to be the sign that He's not going to do what He did in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9. But He has allowed local floods. Seems to me that one of our Brotherhood commentaries doesn't have to really worry about being dogmatic if they just read what the Bible says. And then verse 19, the whole earth was overspread just of the sons of Noah. In chapter 11, verse 1, the whole earth was of one language after the flood. In Genesis 11, verse 9, all men lived in one place after the flood. Now let's jump to the New Testament, Matthew 24. Jesus is warning about what was going to come. And He said in verse 39, the flood took them all away. And in Luke 17:27, in the same context, the flood destroyed them all. And then in 1 Peter 3:20, Peter says, only 8 souls were saved on the ark through the flood. And in 2 Peter 2, verse 5, God spared not the old world. Now the word for world there is cosmos. And that refers to the ordained thing, the outer part of the earth. Now, the whole earth didn't disappear, but the outer part of it was ruined from the way it had been before. Also in verse 5, it says that God brought the flood on the world of the ungodly. And then in that same verse, the word for flood is cataclysmos. We get our word cataclysm from that. And that word in the New Testament is only used in reference to Noah's flood. There are other words in the New Testament for flood, but they do not refer to Noah's flood. So both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, God used special words when he was referring to the flood of Noah's time. And then in 2 Peter 3rd chapter, verse 6, it says, "The world that then was perished by the watery cataclysm." Now, I don't believe that I'm being dogmatic, at least for Bible believers, by reading these verses and saying, you know what? The flood was worldwide. I think there is no question about what God, through Moses, was trying to write to us, or what Jesus was trying to tell us, or what Peter, through inspiration, was trying to tell us. Certainly, we would understand that the Bible claims that the flood was worldwide. But let's go to the other area. Let's go to non-biblical arguments for a worldwide flood. And I have a few of those that I think will even help people who are interested in the science field. One of them is that when we trace back the origin of civilization, it always goes back to the Ararat Babylon area. As a matter of fact, I have an article here out of the newspaper that shows where the origin of civilization came from, and it is in this very place, just as we would expect by reading the Bible. Secondly, do you know how many people there are alive today? Well, there's about 6.3 billion or maybe 6.4 or 5 billion alive, and of course that grows every few years now. But we also know how many people there were in 1950 and 1900 and 1830 and so on. And we can, by mathematics, we can go back to figure how many people or how long it would be until you got back to about 8 people. Now, I have some folks who have done some math work for me, and I don't know how to do that. But both of these use the same kind of figures, and one of them, and they both came up to about the same amount. These are quite a few pages of things, but probably that if the flood of Noah happened in about 12,217 BC. Now I realize that doesn't fit with 6,000 years, but as we talked in another lesson, you know that 6,000 years is not something you read about in the Bible. That's something that has to be figured. Well, according to mathematics, using the figures that we know from present day back to 1960 to 1930 to 1850, and back to about AD 30, how many people there were. Mathematicians can figure that out. And 2 different ones have come up with the idea that it's about that same amount. Now, if you change one of those figures, instead of going back to 12,000 BC, it would be about 7,700 BC. But the idea is, whichever figures you want to use, it's a few thousand years ago that is all it takes to get back to 8 people totally alive on the face of the earth. You don't have to have millions of years, and certainly you don't have to go hundreds of thousands of years or even tens of thousands of years. So mathematics is able to help us with that. We also know that there are some things we read about in the newspaper, and of course some of these dates may be a little bit off, but we find Syrian cities ruins 6,000 years old. And so we do have some things that help us to go back a number of thousand years after Noah's flood. And so we know that it was a few thousand years ago, but to say that it was like 4,300 years ago would be a little bit too strict from things that we know about other historical events and some of the good dating procedures, not the wild ones that evolutionists use. And if you've been with us in this whole series, you know that we've already talked about the various kinds of dating problems that there are. Also, if we go back to the oldest living things, we find that they're only 8,600 years old, and that's the bristlecone pine. According to the tree ring count, bristlecone pines, I knew I could say that, go back to about 8,600 years old. Now, if you've studied tree ring dating, you know that trees do not necessarily make just one ring a year. Some of them can make more than one, but that would be a maximum. 8,600 years ago would be when trees started coming back up again and we're counting the rings. Now, assuming that some of those years would put 2 rings on there, well, then it wouldn't even be 8,000 years ago. But you see how that kind of harmonizes with some of those other statistics? And then the worldwide occurrence of water-laid sediments and sedimentary rocks. All over the earth, we have water-laid sediments. And there was a man who, now I don't like really the title of the article, it says New Revelations on Biblical Flood, but I do like something that he discovered. He went to a certain place here on earth, which I guess was convenient, but he did some carbon dating techniques. Now, we've already talked about carbon dating is not accurate past about 3,500 years ago. So his dates are going to be off, but listen to what he found. He looked in some fresh water and found that the shells that were there, the little clams and mollusks and so on, were 7,400 years old. But then he found marine shells in the same area. In other words, it had been salt water before, afterwards, and they were only 6,800 years old, which means here was an area that used to be fresh water, but there was, a few hundred years after that, salt water. Now, where did that salt water come from? But perhaps a worldwide flood. Also, even evolutionists believe that our mountain ranges have just recently come up. Now, in their idea, recent might mean like 10 million years ago. But the very fact that they even say that they're recent is what I would like to talk about. Our major mountain ranges are called young. And we'd have to get into a whole nother thing to talk about that. But let me show you why. Not too long ago, there was a very big earthquake in Idaho, and Mount Bora, which is Idaho's tallest peak, literally moved. This was a large earthquake. It was between 6.9 and 7.2 on the Richter scale, but it had been 12,662 feet above sea level. In that one earthquake, it moved up 15 feet. Now, do you remember in the Bible in Psalm 104, we said we were going to talk about that? It said, the mountains rose and the valleys sank. That's why I was saying earlier, you don't have to think that the water of the flood was over the top of Mount Everest at 29,000 feet. Mount Everest used to be a lot lower. One of the reasons we know that is because, and this is another evidence, there are marine fossils, saltwater fossils, on the top of every major mountain range in the world, which means they were lower and the water covered them. Now, I've even got another article, and this happened in the area of Los Angeles, California, and in one earthquake, the mountain called Oat Mountain jumped up 15 inches. And this was not even a major earthquake. And so really what God is talking about in Psalm 104 is that with the subterranean waters coming up from the bottom and the rain coming down from the top, the tectonic forces that were on the earth certainly would make major changes on the surface of the earth. It did not look like it did when Noah got in the ark, when he came off the ark. So the world was totally different then. Also, there is scientific evidence of worldwide warmer climate. Now, that would indicate that there may have been a canopy, a vapor canopy, circling the entire earth. If so, there are those who believe that as much as 40 feet of water could be in that vapor canopy. But let me show you some of the things that have proven that the earth isn't exactly like it is today, that it was a warmer climate, which a canopy would do. For example, we have evidence of a fallen 90-foot fruit tree with ripe fruit and green leaves still on its branches, and it's been found in the frozen ground of New Siberian islands. Now, the only tree vegetation that grows now is a 1-inch high willow. In addition, palm tree fossils have been found in early tertiary strata in Alaska. Large fossil leaves of tropical plants have been found in Permian sandstone 250 miles from the South Pole. So there is a great deal of evidence, and there's more to read about that, but I just wanted to show you that what we're saying is that everything the way it is today has not always been the same. It's been changed, and the flood would be the most logical way to explain that change because it fits with everything that we know. Another area that scientifically that would help us to understand the worldwide flood is it was necessary, as we just stated about fossils, if you were in that study, it is necessary to have a catastrophic burial for the kinds of fossils that we have. Both for coal, you have to have tons and tons and millions of tons of trees and other vegetation washing into one place and being covered with high pressure in order to turn to the coal beds that we have today. And to answer the question of where did the thousands and thousands of dinosaur fossils that we have all in one place, one area in Montana, or perhaps the billions of vertebrate fossils that we have in Africa, what is happening today like that? Well, sometime in the past, there had to be catastrophic burial and rapidly turning into stone happening that is not happening today. And the worldwide flood would account for that. Next, we have worldwide distribution of all types of fossils. All of one kind of fossils are not in America, and another kind in South America, and another kind in Asia, and another kind in Africa. They're all kinds all over the world, which indicates that these animals either lived in these various places all over the world, or they were washed to these places, deposited and covered, and turned into fossils under great pressure as the sediment turned into stone. Also, we have evidence of recent water bodies in some places where deserts are. In the western United States, there is great study that's been done to show that there used to be gigantic lakes in some of those areas. And we even have the water lines that were evident as that water receded over years. And certainly that would be exactly what happened if there was a worldwide flood. It would leave water lines, evidence of water covering that area. We have that, by the way, all over the world in various places. Next, we have universal occurrence of rivers in valleys that are too large for the present stream to have occurred. In the Grand Canyon, which is used so much by evolutionists, I just must read to you this particular account here about it. The Grand Canyon and theories concerning its formation have long inspired interest by geologists, evolutionists, and creationists alike. Evolutionary geologists have expressed increasing frustration at attempts to explain the Grand Canyon's formation. Evolutionary geologists believe that the area encompassing much of the canyon was uplifted 65 million years ago, but that the Colorado River, which runs through it, did not originate until about 4 million years ago. Now, it's pretty obvious that if these assumptions are correct, the Colorado River could not have cut the Grand Canyon. Because if the Colorado River, a new river, encountered an uplift area, I don't know of any rivers that go uphill, do you? You see, rivers go downhill. And so it would never have climbed up over it and finally cut a canyon through it. It would simply flow around it. In the museum on the south rim of the Grand Canyon is a description of several geological theories on the formation, and it's followed by an admission that all of these theories have serious faults. The Havasupai Indian account of the formation of the canyon is then given, and according to these Indians who live in one of the offshoots of the canyon, the Grand Canyon formed during a great worldwide flood. Well, we have evidence to support that idea, but we don't have support of the Colorado River actually forming the Grand Canyon. As a matter of fact, in a little while, I'm going to read to you their story of the flood. And of course, it'll be in some ways similar to the Bible, but in a number of ways different. Again, another evidence of a worldwide flood is the preservation of tracks and other very delicate markings throughout the geologic column. How can we preserve a track today until it fossilizes? A track happens today, the wind blows it over and nothing is there. Water comes down, washes it away, it's gone. And the other things that we talked about in our previous lesson. And then we have the occurrence of all rock types throughout the entire world. We have shale, we have limestone, we have granite in all the so-called ages that the evolutionists want us to talk about. Not long ago, Mr. Baumgartner, who is a physicist, came up with a concept. It's called the geophysics of God. It's an article that came out in the U.S. News and World Report, June of 1997. And I'm not going to be reading a lot from this. What I want you to know is that he has come up with a scientific explanation of exactly what would have happened on the earth if the great fountains of the deep burst forth. And that explanation you can read about by going to that article on the internet or from other sources to find out about it. As a matter of fact, even though at the time he was not working with the Creation Research Group, as a matter of fact, he was with the Los Alamos Laboratory of U.S. Department of Energy at the time that this article was written. But now he does work with the Institute for Creation Research. And his research has now been put on video and in a book. And you can find out about that from the ICR that we've talked about a number of times. ICR.org. You can go on the internet to find out about. Also, another thing that shows worldwide flood is we have no meteorite evidence except in the geologic column that's on the earth now. Now, let me explain this. If the earth was here for 1 billion years, think how many meteorites would be hitting it. Then there would be another strata, and then another strata, and meteorites would hit that, and another strata, meteorites would hit that, and so on. But we don't have that. We just have meteorites in our strata. Now, if there was a flood a few thousand years ago that wiped out everything, and then we're just living on something that the flood caused, the only place we would find meteorites would be in the upper strata. And so that's another argument for a worldwide flood. Also, the absence of hail imprints. Now, I told you earlier, we do have fossilized rain prints. Raindrops come down, hit in the mud, make little indentations, that gets covered up and it gets pressure on it and it becomes fossilized into stone. Well, we do not have any hail imprints. And what that suggests is, again, that canopy covered the earth. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in another presentation later on. But if that canopy covered the earth and everything was warm, pretty much the same temperature, we wouldn't have had hail. We would just have rain. And then finally, there is a worldwide distribution of flood traditions. I mentioned some of these before, but let me give you this on this presentation too. In North America, there are 59 ancient civilizations that have been traced that have an account of the flood. In Central and South America, there are 46 ancient civilizations that have been traced that have an account of a flood. a major flood, and we'll describe this in a minute. In Europe, there are 31 civilizations that have been traced that have an account of the flood. In the Middle East, there are 17 civilizations that have been traced that have an account of the flood. In Asia, there are 23 civilizations that have an account of the flood. And in the South Sea Islands, there are 37 civilizations that have been traced with an account of the flood. Now, there are some very interesting stories about all of these, and you would not expect that all of them would be exactly alike. Let me read to you the one about the Havasupai Indians. Before there were many people on earth, there were two gods, Tokapa of goodness and Hokamata of evil. I'm just reading now what this legend says. Tokapa had a daughter named Puke'e, whom he hoped would become the mother of all living. Did you catch that phrase right there? You ever hear about that before? Hokamata, the evil, was determined that no such thing would take place, and he covered the world with a great flood. Tokapa, the good, felled a giant tree and hollowed out the trunk. He placed Puke'e in the hollowed trunk, and when the water rose and flooded the earth, she was secure in her boat. Finally, the flood waters receded, and mountain peaks emerged. Rivers were created, and one of them cut the great gushing fissure, which became the Grand Canyon. Puke'e, in her log, came to rest on the new earth. She stepped forth and beheld an empty world. When the land became dry, a great golden sun rose in the east and warmed the earth and caused her to conceive. In time, she gave birth to a male child. Later, a waterfall caused her to conceive, and she gave birth to a girl. From the union of these two mortal children came all the people on the earth. The first were the Havasupai, and the voice of Tokapa spoke to them and told them to live forever in peace in their canyon of good earth and pure water, where there would always be plenty for all. Now, this is not exactly like the biblical story as I've suggested, but look at the things. There was the warning of a flood. There was the salvation of a person in a boat type thing, and landed in certain places where they lived from then on, and that the people that came out of that were the ones that now populate the earth. You see, you wouldn't expect all of them to be like the Bible, because if there were 8 people who came off the ark, from those 3 sons of Noah came all the other people on the face of the earth. And so as people left the area and left God, maybe after the languages were changed, then some of them, as we know, became very evil again. And as they would begin to change their stories, their names, their places, it would still have a germ of truth in it, but it would be as they perverted it down through the years. Only the biblical account is going to be the inspired account of God. But let me show you how much similarity there is between the stories. In all of the stories, 217 of them that we have collected so far that talk about a flood, 88% of them all talk about a favored person or family. 66% of them say that they were forewarned about it. 66% of them say the flood was due to wickedness. 95% of them say that the catastrophe was only a flood. 95% of them say it covered the entire earth. 70% of them had survival in a boat of some sort. 67% of them had animals also saved in that boat. 73% of them had animals playing some other part, maybe not in the boat, but were connected with it. 57% of them had the survivors landing on a mountain. 82% of them had the geography that is named when they got off as the local geography from where they were. And 35% of them had birds sent out. 75% of them had the rainbow mentioned. 13% of them had survivors offering a sacrifice. And then only 9% of them had specifically 8 people saved through the flood. What we've looked at is the biblical claim of a worldwide flood, with the promise that God made with the rainbow, that he had never knew again what he had done then. If you believe God, certainly you believe the flood was worldwide. And then we've looked at scientific evidence, not only from literal scientific discoveries and so on, but also even as we gathered the various tribal customs about a flood, we see that universally we're very, very safe in saying, just like the Bible does, the flood was worldwide.